Welcome to Charts Today Europe. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Monday, the 29th of October, comes to you from London. European markets haven't opened yet, but we've had a heads up in Asia, and we've got the futures to guide us. The dollar is actually holding on to its strength, and we start by looking at that. But of course, the US markets closed lower on Friday, so that's having an impact on sentiment. So looking at the dollar index, still strong. The euro relatively weak against the dollar, although it's recovering a little bit this morning. And the yen, actually, we're seeing the dollar just sinking here. Sterling down again, sitting at 128 and looking like it will go to 126.60 based on the short-term target. And the euro against the sterling we're seeing is lower as well. Against the Swiss franc, sterling is still weak, and against the Aussie dollar, sterling hitting new lows in the 180s there. So we are just seeing long term we're still bullish here, medium term bullish, but short term bearish, and we see that picture on lots of these charts. Looking at Bitcoin. We are fairly flat the last several weeks, and if we get to US markets, here's where we see really the fall off. Remembering this is my long term, my medium term, and my short term. So on the weekly chart, we had another very bad week. We see that showing up in the candle for last week. We saw the S&P closed down 1.75% on Friday. It actually was lower. We see on that daily candle there's quite a variation in price. And we again see that just in the seesaw here on the 60-minute chart. But we have got targets of 8% lower and 9.5% lower on the medium term, so still could fall further in the US. It's not potentially over yet, and we've got 12% downside on the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq was down 2.3% on Friday, and now looking medium term bearish. With long term, we're holding on to the bullishness. We may find supports here somewhere on the cloud here, but we do still have downside potential here of 6% on 6.7% on the short term, 12% on the upside. So we are seeing really a shortage of upside targets and more downside targets creeping in. The Dow, similar picture. We do have an upside target, but we have a downside target of 10, 11%. And looking at the Russell 2000 index, this is probably the most bearish of the US indices. The broader based stocks falling more heavily, and we're down. We've got downside targets some 16% lower. We are now just testing support on this long-term trend, so it'll be interesting to see. Looking at the futures in the US, the S&P futures down 0.25%, and the Nasdaq E-mini is only up 0.8%. It's earlier in the day yet to say, but it does look like the markets will open weaker. The UK market's up 0.8% this morning on the future, and the German market up 0.75%. So similar moves there. Looking at the cash markets, FTSE has a downside target of further 3% lower. We are just sitting right on long-term support on the point and figure chart, but the weekly cloud is bearish. This is bucking the trend in the US, where we're seeing the UK market looking weaker, and mid caps we're seeing also now through the cloud on the medium term and long-term charts, so bearish here as well. Although there is a shortage of downside targets. The DAX in Germany, we do have one downside target here of 12%, but really interestingly, on this short-term target, lots of selling waves have given us lots of downside targets, 2%, 3%, two targets to that same level, 3%, and 4.7 and 5.25%. So we are seeing multiple targets, really suggesting we will see further sell-off in Germany. And of course, political news out there this morning may have an impact as well. The CAC Quarante, similarly, we've got downside targets, and now just starting to break the long-term trend here as well. Japan was down overnight. Hong Kong was up slightly, but the big one was China down. And China's giving us a new downside target here, not yet activated, but really worrying that we're seeing these new targets develop. If we move to new lows, that activates that target as well. We've got targets of 36, 43, 22% lower, and we were talking about these targets as all year really, so that's still hanging over us in terms of global markets. The Indian market was actually up, but still looking bearish, medium and short term, with downside targets here as well. So we are looking lower there, and the Aussie market bucked the trend, up 1%. Brent crude is off just over 0.5% this morning, so just struggling short term to get bullish. WTI, much the same picture. US nat gas, 3.13%. Gold actually just off slightly today, but still holding that strength and looking like it's going to make this transition to bullish short term. Silver is also looking stronger short term. US 10-year yields sitting at 3.07%, so we are seeing a move lower there as well. So that sentiment just having an impact, and German bonds up on that. Falling yields, rising bonds, so we're seeing bond prices up in Europe this morning. Looking at the individual stocks, we see here the picture is pretty red across the board. This data all coming from Yahoo Finance. Taking a quick look at the Nasdaq, we saw some pretty big falls last week. Amazon was really one of the biggest ones. We saw Amazon down nearly 8% on Friday, with results disappointing, and that long-term relative trend against the Dow Jones is breaking. So Amazon looking a bit more bearish now, and we're through the cloud medium term. So we're starting to see the stocks cracking one by one. Google has actually been bearish medium term for some time. We've got downside targets here. Apple hasn't cracked yet, so Apple is really the one to watch now. We do have a new downside target of 14% on Apple, 13% here, not activated. New lows would activate those targets, but we see the relative strength versus the Dow Jones still outperforming this year by 26%. Taking a look at some of the other stocks, Facebook down 4% on Friday and looking still bearish and turning long-term bearish, with quite big downside potential there. So really quite worrying. And interestingly, if we look at some of the other big caps, we've got Microsoft was down 1.2%. That they've fared fairly well, and looking long term, their trend's still fairly much in train and not quite yet bearish, and holding that relative 25% outperformance. Netflix was down 4%. Nvidia is really selling off now, and Tesla bucked the trend on Friday, up 5%. And we see from the weekly candle there, they had a great week last week, and meeting that upside target that was given. So that's quite bullish confirmation. Looking at the FTSE 100, we saw on Friday that we had many more fallers than gainers, only a handful of stocks in the green. We did see some really big falls again. Everaz down 6%, Ocado down 5%. The key thing is which stocks are holding their trends, and so we're seeing here, for example, BT have been in a long-term bear trend, although they're medium-term transitioning to bullish. The long-term trend is still bearish, and they're struggling to make that recovery. The relative showing a little bit of a recovery as well. Royal Mail, of course, has been really badly hit of late and still sitting in the doldrums. And Royal Bank of Scotland had quite big falls after reporting on Friday, and that's taken them back to long-term bearish with downside targets of 20%. So we're seeing this. Even WPP last week had a really bad week as well, and we're seeing these falls, which is contributing to the market malaise. Looking at the 250, there were stocks that were up on Friday. We had Just Group up 8%, but still looking bearish. I mean, this is the thing, is we're seeing some relief rallies, but a lot of these stocks looking pretty bearish. It's really hard to find stocks that are above the cloud on both weekly and daily charts, and so we're just seeing this picture of bearishness really all across the board. And it's about finding stocks that are actually holding their trends, and there are not many of them. Avcast was down 7%. Travis Perkins down 7%. We saw some pretty big falls there on Friday. Last of all, just looking at Europe, again we saw some quite big performances on Friday, 15% upside, but that's after really the stock plummeting. So there's Nestle actually looking a bit stronger and actually holding its trend. So we did see that on Friday. Kindred Group actually also just struggling there. And although there were some quite good performances, we did see again in Europe on some really big falls. Valeo down in France down 21%. Really big moves here. 19% down off Viscofan, SEB in Paris. These French stocks falling quite heavily on Friday had a big impact on the CAC 40. Anyway, that's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.